Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you for putting this on and having all of us come here and share our ideas about art and specifically Christian art. After I put this together, I realized I went a little heavy on the actual art of translation itself, and I was a little light on the sanctification, which is probably not the best thing for a vicar to be light on. But I hope to, if I can make enough hay with this, I hope to get to it at the end. Especially, I'll be talking about translation, particularly from ancient Greek theater to contemporary English, which is very, very different than other types of translation. And it's a very different creature than scriptural translation. Even though the language is very similar, the Greek is very similar, not the same, but there's very different principles at play. So what I'll be talking about in the first half is, for lack of a better word, creative translation, I guess. You don't want to be creative when translating scripture. My presentation today is entitled Traditore. If you know Italian, I want to keep this untranslated for the moment, so keep it spoiler-free. If you do know Italian, you'll have an advantage over everyone else, though. To give you an introductory but still very limited idea of the immense difficulty of the craft of translation, I'd like to read from you a quote, an excerpt from the very, very beginning of the Wikipedia article titled Untranslatability. Untranslatability is the article title from wikipedia.org. This article has multiple issues. This article is written like a personal reflection, personal essay, or argumentative essay that states personal feelings or presents an original argument about a topic. This article may require cleanup to meet Wikipedia's quality standards. This article needs additional citations for verification. This article may be confusing or unclear to readers. This article possibly contains original research. This article may lack focus or may be about more than one topic. That's the beginning of untranslatability. And all of the above is irrevocably true. It's true about translation, it's true about untranslatability, but it's also more deeply true about the work of the translator. The translator, like the article, has multiple issues, and I'd like to discuss those kind of one by one. The first one is that the translation is an original work of art. This is not how translation is supposed to work. It's supposed to be like a representation, a representation of someone else's work, but inevitably it always becomes an original work of art. The translation, for example, Crime and Punishment translated by Constance Garnett is not Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. It's just different. Translation is nothing more than an original personal statement, even though it appears to be only a representation of another artist's statement. Speaking frankly, there's no work of Plato or Aristotle, for example, in English. For all of their accumulated knowledge, Plato and Aristotle did not know English. Their work exists in English as some English speaker thinks it ought to exist in English, but it is not their work. This is why I suspect many, many, many people think that the ancient Greek writers are boring. It's because their translators are boring. I hold that, absolutely. Each translator is intensely constrained by the limits of their language. The language they are, the source language they're translating from, the target language they're translating to. As the philosopher Wittgenstein put it, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. And if you know multiple languages, you have multiple worlds that you can explore and experience. This is true for the translator as well. They are limited by their knowledge of those languages. It also includes human experience, not just linguistic experience, by which I mean actually having successful experiences communicating with human beings in a personal and authentic manner, something that is not easy for writers to do by nature. It also includes life experience, by which I mean the personal experience of joy, of loss, of contentment, of elation, of hope, of failure, of grace, of suffering. So when translating ancient Greek tragedy, one must know the language of ancient Greek, the language of contemporary English, and the language of grief as well. The next issue, translators often have to clean up the language of the source material. This is not like scrubbing out the original author's pen with soap. to get rid of all the bad words. This is instead, it has to do with the idea of translation being something that's word for word. Translation is not word for word. It's not a cipher like A equals 1, B equals 2. It's not like oi moi equals alas. There's a lot more play in there. Nobody says alas in English, but people say oi moi in ancient Greek all the time. It's great. In particular, the one example I have is word order in English matters a lot more than most other languages. You can change word order in ancient Greek. You can change word order in other languages if you have learned Spanish or the Romantic languages or Germanic languages. This holds to be true. In English, it becomes very difficult with word order because place the word only anywhere in the sentence below. Only she told him that she loved him. She only told him that she loved him. She told only him that she loved him. She told him only that she loved, etc., etc. Every single place you put the word only changes the meaning of the sentence in English. So maybe clean up the language isn't the best way to put it, but that's what the Wikipedia article said. It needed cleaning up, so that's what I went with. But you need to change the word order. You need to change the words in order to make it make sense in English. This is, yes, okay. Backwards talking, I am not English-centric view of grammatical structure you have. The only reason Yoda sounds like he talks funny is because we think the word order should happen in a certain way, and it doesn't make sense to us otherwise. The third issue, translators must have a clear reason and justification for every single word. This is any writer at all, of course. I hope this is self-explanatory. 4, the translator is often confused. This, of course, applies to every other writer as well. You're working with two often non-complementary language structures. The vocabularies and grammars of each language have been used in a variety of different and even contradictory ways throughout time. Each word has several meanings, and often its etymology is of little or no use to you in how to properly translate it. Creative writers in any language like to be creative, and they will break the rules of language just as often as they will keep them. I love it, but you want to seek clarity but embrace confusion because it will happen. The translator must research, most especially in the area of the entirety of accumulated human knowledge. It's, no big deal. The entirety of human knowledge. You are not merely translating words, you are translating culture, history, religion, philosophy, social norms, human psychology, artistic ideologies, political ideologies, etc., all of which are constantly in flux throughout time and across continents. So, good luck, we're all counting on you. Next, the translator must contend with his or her own artistic vision. You're going to have, unless you're translating your own work into another language, you're going to have disagreements about artistic vision with the original author of the text, just fundamental philosophical artistic differences. So you have to wrestle with your own artistic vision and what the intention of the original author is as well. I like this idea of contend, wrestle with. I feel an affinity to Jacob in the Old Testament, wrestles with God. I feel like that's also a good analogy to being an artist as well. Like the blessing is not just given out freely. The gospel absolutely is, but the blessing has to be wrestled for. I like that. And you have to contend with this. Coinciding with this, we'll get to the question in a bit. Coinciding with this, just by virtue of being an artist, the translator must be immensely conceited. The translator must say, the reason I am translating this work is that no matter how many other brilliant minds have already attempted it, it has not yet been translated to my satisfaction. If the work already exists better elsewhere from someone else's pen, why even try? If you've already found a translation that is satisfactory to you enough, then there's no need for you to try to contribute your own. Bookshelves are heavy enough as it is. Perhaps it's unfair to say translators must be conceited when the closer to the heart of the matter is that translator ought to have a distinctive artistic vision for the work. which, as I said, has to contend with the distinctive artistic vision of the original author. I oftentimes wonder if being distinctly conceited and having a distinct conceit are not one and the same thing, artistically speaking, or at least synonyms. So translators must be able to answer this question. Why does your translation need to exist? Now, this is true of all artists. All artists must face this question about the work they produce. Whether or not they are obligated to provide an answer is something that the craft itself probably determines. But I feel that a translator owes an explanation, specifically, or especially so if the work, as is always the case in ancient Greek theater, if the work, the source material, has already been translated countless times by better thinkers, better scholars, and better artists. I could go into far more detail about all of these points. Where brevity is the soul of wit, I find myself witless very often. But hopefully I will make it to the point of the presentation where I reveal the meaning of the title of the presentation. Traditore. We're getting there. I would like to introduce my method for translating. I call it the cesspit method. For the first initials of each of the 5 stages, it is the only correct methodology of translation because it is my own methodology. Step 1, contextual translation. You translate the passage in the context of what comes before and after, what's in the rest of the scene, what's in the rest of in this case, the play as a whole. This is essential in scriptural translation. You don't want to translate out of context. You don't want to take one passage out of its context and its intended focus. But it's important with any type of translation as well. I also have this is sort of my term that I came up with. I also have a pretentious academic term that you can write down and use to impress your friends at cocktail parties. Not if you're underage in college, sorry. Pretentious academic term here after the Pratt is the commutation event. This is the analysis of the signifying systems as a whole. I don't get it either. Literal. Next step, once you have the context, the literal translation. I don't like the word literal. Maybe verbatim is better. I don't like it when we as translators say, this word in Greek literally means, et cetera, et cetera. This is translating each word according to dictionary definitions and according to the textbook grammatical sense of the source language. This will likely be clunky, unclear, or even unreadable as an English sentence. The Pratt for this is syntagmatic translation, analysis of constituent surface structures of grammatical segments. Next is readable translation. So you take the context, you take the literal translation, and now you make it readable. You render step 2 into English that is grammatically sensical. This still may be a little clunky, but the English grammar ought to be clear as well as the underlying sense of what is being conveyed. Some items may yet require further clarification and work, as we'll see in steps 4 and 5. I call this one paradigmatic translation, analysis of linguistic paradigms embedded in the text rather than the simple surface structure of this. Okay. Next is subtextual translation. So those 3 have dealt with the text as it stands. Now we're moving into the subtext. What's the message beneath the syntax, grammar, and the immediate sense? For example, when Norman Bates says, a boy's best friend is his mother, is he merely making polite dinner conversation with Marion Crane? Taking into consideration, when you do this with ancient Greek tragedy, ancient Greek customs, culture, history, literature, philosophy, and religion. I call this one implicative parallax translation. I created this term myself. I'm very proud of it. The background information underlying, but not explicitly contained within, the word or segment is brought in to reframe the syntagmatic and paradigmatic translations. It's basically saying subtext. Next, the translation. Finally, this is employing the tools and techniques of English literary craft to render the segment into the best possible words in the best possible order. Here, what words and orderings are best is determined by all of the above steps, as well as, that is by recalling the segment's context, as well as literary devices, figures of speech, cultural, social implications. Also consider the emotional state and psychology of the character, How would he or she express this idea in this situation in English? Keep in mind the character's distinctive history, experience, occupation, social, economic, class, etc., etc. Also keep in mind the conventions of the stage. Is this a choral ode? Is it a monologue? Is it a dialogue? Remember also the speaking character's relationship to whomever he or she is addressing. Remember also to remain as faithful as possible to the language of the original text and author, according to every aspect of the author's use of language, not just the literal meaning. The pretentious academic term for this step is traditore, which means the translator is a traitor. The final prat here, a pretentious academic term, is neither pretentious nor is it academic, because it is the truth. The translator is a traitor. The translator can't help but betray. So at some point throughout this process, you are going to betray the original author, the original text, or the original language. So today, let's betray Euripides. Let's see these 5 steps at work, hopefully I can get through them briefly, in a section from a play called Hekabe. It's called, in English, it's called Hecuba, because the Romans thought the original Greek word Hekabe wasn't good enough, so they had to name it Hecuba. I call it Hekabe because that's her name originally. She's the Queen of Troy. This is a play about her after Troy has fallen. We all know the story, right? The Trojan horse hiding Greek soldiers inside, led into the city, and at midnight they all burst forth and murder everybody and burn the city to the ground. Now the women of Troy are on the beach, awaiting the ships taking them home to their new Greek masters. They've been sold off as slaves and concubines, and Queen Hecuba is among them, and they're just sort of wondering what's going to happen to them. This is the context of what's happening here. So here, Queen Hecuba has asked Odysseus to spare her daughter's life, Polyxene. The Greeks can't leave yet because the winds are not good. They can't sail. The winds aren't good because Achilles, the great hero of the war, has appeared. He died during the war. He was buried. And now his ghost has appeared at his tomb and says, I demand a sacrifice. You Greeks let me die and then bury me here, and you're just going to sail away without giving me anything? I demand a sacrifice. You should sacrifice a young woman to me so she can tend my tomb for all eternity. And then I'll make the winds nice and calm, and you can go sail home. And Odysseus has decided to sacrifice Queen Hecuba's daughter at the tomb. Hecuba has asked Odysseus, this is Odysseus from the Odyssey. He's the one it was his idea to do the Trojan horse in the first place. He was a very, very bad man. He's not a hero. He's intelligent and bright and clever. He's crafty. He's a snake. He'll bite you. Odysseus doesn't care. He's like, let's just get this over with. What does it matter? So Hecabe asks Polyxene herself to convince Odysseus to spare her life. Let her go. Don't do this horrible thing. These are the first lines of her speech to Odysseus, begging for her life. I don't know. It's all Italian to me. So step 2, that's the context. This is step 2, literal. I'm going to just breeze through this here real quick. This is sort of how the process of what's going on. Each line, you look at the verbs, you look at the nouns, and you sort of break it down. This is tense, voice, mood, person, number, present, active, indicative, first singular, et cetera, et cetera. You just break it down grammatically, and you get a general sense of what's going on. So the literal, quote unquote, that we have, I see you, Odysseus, right to under outer garment, hiding hand and face back, turning, not yours, I might touch beard. Beard, the word beard, is a feminine noun in Greek. Interesting. Anyway, next, readable translation. This is where we organize it to make it a bit more readable. This is a really kind of grammatically simple phrase or sentence, so it makes it easy. I see you, Odysseus, hiding your right hand under your cloak and turning your face back so that I might not touch your beard. One example of how we change the word order around and sort of clean things up. Here, dexion means right, and chera means hand. So here we have the right hand, which in English we would say is right hand, and that's the way it makes sense. But if we think this thought in Greek but speak it in English, we add more words in between the adjective and the noun, and it turns into right under your outer cloak hiding hand. So your right hand that's hiding under your outer cloak, if that makes sense. So we need to switch that around and clean it up a bit. Now, we know exactly what this means. It's clear. We understand what he's doing. We understand what she's saying. We have no idea what she means, though, right? Why does he not want her to touch his beard? This makes no sense to us, which is where the subtext comes into play. Many translators, by the way, just leave it as is. A lot of the translations I looked at just kind of don't even bother with that. Here we need additional information. Hiding your right hand under your cloak. Why is he doing that? Turning your face back or away so that she might not touch his beard. What is going on? I skipped ahead a bit here. I need to see what's going on myself. So we do need additional information of the text in order to make sense of this. In ancient Greece, as it is today, the right hand is associated with swearing oaths. When you're swearing oaths or something, making a very solemn promise, a statement that will be held accountable to you, it's associated with your right hand. We raise our right hand and make swears when we swear into office or when we give testimony in court, etc. However, in ancient Greece, touching someone's beard was also a sign of making an oath. So you would grab them by the beard, and you would say, "This is a sacred, solemn oath before Zeus himself. When I touch your right hand, I am not touching your right hand, I'm touching Zeus's right hand. When I touch your beard, I'm not touching your beard, I am touching the beard of Zeus himself, holding you accountable to Zeus and all of the gods." So it's sort of like the person stands in as the gods, and so they will be held accountable. So actually Ron Burgundy has a better knowledge of the classics than I think I even do. So it's an actual historic cultural thing. So now we understand what Odysseus is doing. He does not want to spare Polyxena's life. He wants to kill her and just be on his way. He doesn't care about these people. He does not want to be held accountable for her life to Zeus himself. And he knows if she tries to grab his hand or grab his beard, then she will make a solemn oath to the gods themselves, and he will be held accountable to that. And he does not want that to happen. So even before she can do that, he turns his face away, he hides his hand in his cloak, and he turns his beard away from her so she can't grab onto it and make this solemn pledge. And so knowing that, understanding that, we have a much clearer picture of the scene and the characters and what is actually going on and what's at stake here. At least Odysseus is honest about being dishonest. We can give him that. So then finally, this is my own personal final rendition of it. You just sum up all the rest of the steps and render it into the best possible words in the best possible order. It's a bit longer. "I see you, Odysseus. I know what you're doing, hiding your right hand in your cloak and turning your face away. So I can't make a sacred supplication by touching your hand or beard, and so hold you accountable to the gods." My additions to this text are in blue. These are not Euripides' words. These are my own. They are part of the subtext of Euripides' words. They're what he intended and what his audience would have gotten from that original text. But I put words into his pen when I did this, or into his stylus, I don't know. It sort of borders on a cardinal sin in writing dialogue where you give exposition, talking about what's going on rather than actually having it go on. There's no reason why Polyxena would have to explain this to Odysseus in the scene itself. They both know this information, so it's redundant. The problem is audiences don't know it, and so you can either be really, really faithful to Euripides and leave it unclear and betray Euripides to the audience, or you can be really, really faithful to Euripides and make it clear to the audience and betray Euripides. With this section, each way to translate it into English is wrong because of this implication that's beneath the text of the text. There's no way to faithfully translate the literal text, for you would completely overlook this cultural, religious, moral sense to it. And there's no way to faithfully translate the implied text, because you would, as I have done, venture beyond Euripides' words and out of necessity put your own words into his mouth. The unfortunate, inescapable futility of the craft of translation is that no matter what happens, no matter how you translate something, you will have to be disingenuous, because the translator is a traitor. I think I have just a few minutes. I wanted to go more into this, but this obviously raises a large number of questions when you move into talking about translating Holy Scripture, right? If we can't help but be traitors to the original author and the original text, what does that mean when we translate Scripture? Are we all, in a sense, being Judas to the Word, right? Judas betrays Jesus, the Word made flesh, with a kiss. Is it completely escapable for us to be Judas? And I don't know. I wish I could go into more detail about this, because there are very specific elements of the Greek language in the New Testament that do provide difficulty, and that do kind of provide a lot of questions of how you translate it and what information to provide to a reader today, and in what way to do that. I think footnotes are probably a really good way to do it, rather than adjusting the text itself. If that section, those lines in Euripides were brought into the New Testament, I would make a footnote. I would not put it into the mouth of the original writer itself. I do think that, though, it gives us a very good warning about the delicacy of handling the original languages of ancient Scripture, and how seriously we should take that. I think the only way to actually betray God's Word, to be a Judas to the Word, is to not care about it, to downplay that we need to study the original languages, that we need pastors that are able to understand and comprehend and work with the original languages. Obviously, as much as I would find it absolutely wonderful, we can't all just go out and learn Hebrew and Greek. So it does require that we have pastors that are well trained in the original languages. It requires we make it a priority, because I think downplaying the need for that is, in a sense, turning your back on the way God originally revealed His word of salvation to us. It may be, I may be preaching to the choir here in confessional Lutheranism, where we do place a really high value on studying the original languages and getting a sense not only of the language, but the culture, social norms, the allusions and things that are at play in the text itself. How seriously we take that is not how seriously many other church groups, denominations, and unfortunately pastors take it. And I would say that the translator as a traitor to Scripture is, if you just pay mere lip service to the Scriptures, that is the kiss of Judas. But if you ultimately acknowledging scriptural authority and the authority of the original languages is an act of deep humility, especially as a translator, because it's saying, my personal preferences, my understanding, anything having to do with me, doesn't matter. It all goes away, because Holy Scripture, as God revealed it to us, is the ultimate authority in all things. And so I think that, holding to that scriptural principle in translating, is not the kiss of Judas, but the tears of Peter, perhaps we'll say that. Despairing of himself, but trusting fully in Christ. And hopefully there may be questions about this in the question and answer session. That is all I've prepared. Thank you very much.
It's good to be here today, and I'm really glad that this event is happening. 2 out of the 3 of the speakers today have the wardrobe memo. You'll see the next one. Didn't quite get it. I'd like to talk today about an idea pushing us forward into the future, about an idea that I've been working on for a while. I've been studying and developing, and I've been talking kind of in people's offices and in cars I've been talking with people privately about this for quite a while. I've been doing studies, and it was part of my master's work. And I'll qualify what I'm going to say today by making sure you understand that I don't think this is a finished idea. This is a stop along the way that I'm now, I think, ready to let it out into the wild and see what this does. I'm more interested in a discussion than dictating terms. This isn't me saying things have to be this way. I just think it would be interesting to talk about things going this way, especially in terms of educating artists in confessional Lutheran circles. So, quick overview, setting aside the idea of sanctifying, setting aside a place for Christian creatives. And we've had a really great series of presenters at this conference that have given us a good foundation of how we've gotten where we are. What's the past, the foundation that we're built upon, and that's really important. And I want to talk about where do we go next. So, bullet points. I've learned that maybe you don't read bullet points for people. So if things go well, we'll talk about these things. A quick 2 minutes and some seconds of what I do and kind of a highlight reel of my work, just to kind of give you a sense if you're not familiar with my work. Oh. Sorry, we got to get back to the beginning here. Quick review. Malfunctioning. Okay. So hopefully this is a coherent discussion. I have a lot of thoughts about this, and they're kind of cloudy. They're kind of sloshing around. So I really hope that I can kind of be timely. State of the Arts. We've kind of gone through this yesterday. I was tuned in at home in my basement watching on TV. Watching the live stream. But some of this stuff was touched on yesterday. The idea of art for art's sake became a closed loop in the 20th century. This idea that the artist is sort of the reason that art exists. And it becomes an exclusive club. And what I'm really interested in is this lost sense of craft and service in the art community. I think if you look back to medieval practices, the idea of art or craft had a different connotation to it. Your art was something that you practiced, like the art of medicine, the art of architecture, the art of speaking, or legal arts. And so it was not an exclusive sort of term. Everybody sort of did their art. It's sort of a stand-in for vocation. Vocation's really fascinating to me. Nowadays, we've got a culture that really is about separation, and this is more than art. You know, I take a hit at museums here because when you go to a museum, you have things out of place. This is an unnatural combination. Pieces of art were developed for a specific community and for a specific location, and that's a symptom of the way that we operate nowadays, because I would say because of scientific thinking, that we think it's okay to separate things. We think it's really important to get at the truth of something, that we need to be remote from it. You don't want to have a bias. Sorry, I said I'd hold her. So I think, you know, right now we're in a place, after all of this, longing for participation and accessibility. There seems to be a divide between art world and like everybody else. Are we all allowed into this or not? And so strange things are happening with this longing to participate in aesthetics, cosplay, dressing up as your artistic character, and then like participating. People want to be a part of something. Kanye West is making all kinds of hay right now. He has free concerts. People are scalping those tickets for $500. And it's not a concert, it's a worship service, you know, a Sunday worship service. He's a very interesting phenomenon right now. The return of vinyl, you know, there's this longing to like hold your music when nowadays it's so, where is it? It's gone. There's no artwork, there's no object. It's just this ephemeral idea. Craft brewers, DIY culture is the prodigal ready to return. Have we gone far enough down this road of remoteness? Far enough down this road of separation? We have a mediated experience in our devices. Right now, you know, I'm participating in that by talking to people out through a camera. Congratulations on being here, you that are here, and congratulations on tuning in, you that are experiencing this in a mediated way. Okay, so now let's get into my idea. I envision a means of training artists in an on-the-job kind of way, meaning that I compare this to like the work site of a cathedral. You learn on the job. These things need to be done, and so there, of course, has to be a demand. There has to be jobs for this to work. Students would be participating in the business of making art. And who knows what that will be? Nobody knows what that will be. It depends on what is requested, what is on the books, what are the jobs that have to happen at this particular moment. And so the education, you know, kind of shifts and is in flux with the particular jobs at the moment. Students would also be involved in business-related aspects that would be a natural preparation for them to do this on their own. Never know what will come in, and you know, there's opportunities for this to be a roadshow too, to go to places and leave artwork behind. The mission field, building sites, I think of Builders for Christ, that kind of organization. How cool would it be to take students to a new building site and leave them with an altarpiece? This is all built on the idea of mentorship. Old is new. This is not a new idea, but it's fallen out of practice. The apprenticeship system is something that I've really been fascinated by since my days as a young Michelangelo art camper with Bill Bukowski. He talked about this idea. We were the right age. We were 12, 13 years old. And he'd say, this is about the time you would go join a studio and be an apprentice. So that's a good idea, and it has limitations too, because that system is really a vocational system. It's really about learning that one thing really well, and maybe there's some pretty big gaps in the rest of your education. So, it's not necessarily completely appropriate for today yet. This exists. The Cranbrook Academy of Art in Michigan is, I think, a fascinating model to look at. They have visiting artists, resident artists who live on campus and have studios on campus. Their students have studios on campus. And it's a community kind of model where they're constantly kind of dwelling and working together. And a student in a certain field gets paired up with an artist in residence in that field. And this becomes your mentor that will guide the programming. That relationship will determine what you will learn. You have an agreement about how you're going to fulfill a program. Recent studies, especially in higher education, are finding that relationships motivate. Student retention is much higher. Student satisfaction with their experience in college is much higher when they connect with an individual, when they connect with a person and or a program. I'm not making this up. These are problem-solving. This is a problem that needs to be solved. Higher education needs to figure out retention. And right now, college is in question in our culture, whether or not this is a good idea to go to college. So I think, we've got a lot to prove that way. Especially in the field of studio art, I feel like there's a lot to prove. People are wondering, there's always been this question, parents are always asking, well, is my kid going to have a job? What are you going to do with an art degree? And of course, as a practicing artist, I say, what can't you do with an art degree? It's like a communications degree. You can do anything. My wife asks me, how'd you learn how to weld? How do you know about woodworking? How do you know how to fix the electricity in our house? Well, I'm an art major. You learn like everything. So what's in the way is a perception, but also I think it would be advantageous to provide obvious outcomes. And a structure like this would in itself become a location for developing skills and for actually answering that question, what are you going to do? Well, you could do this. You could come here, be a resident artist for a while. It's one way to answer that question. So practicalities have to be thought of. And I'll say this, I'm standing on Bethany campus and somewhat thinking about Bethany campus, but these ideas don't have to happen anywhere in particular. I think this could happen on a college campus. I think it could happen on a farm with some nice cabins. I think it could happen in a downtown empty building, an old Walmart or something, something that's vacated. I think that's why I'm interested in discussion, not necessarily being the final word. So some thoughts about the practicalities of this. You need to have some spaces, housing. You got to have some money. There's a lot of money involved with this idea, I think. And we're creating ministerial artists and hopefully changing the culture of confessional Lutheranism, especially with visual culture. So spaces. I've got some ideas about studio spaces, living spaces, and then community. You need different kinds of spaces. So maker spaces would range from dedicated shops that are specific to their field, especially when a lot of equipment is involved. So a woodworking shop probably has to always be a woodworking shop, or a bronze foundry, or a weaving facility. Those looms take up space. Stained glass kind of needs its space. There are other spaces that can, I think, share, like drawing and painting maybe could be in a similar similar space with, good light, and it's a similar kind of activity. And then some rooms could be converted. They could look something like this, or a classroom, just some kind of a box. That could kind of rotate depending on the courses or the activities that happen. A computer lab, I think, would be a really good idea. I'm attracted to the blacksmithing and stone carving aspect of this, but I'm not a Luddite. I do understand, and you saw in some of the highlight reel that the computer is a very important piece of Christian expression today. And I think, VR is a pretty exciting field to look into. All right, so those are all sort of teaching/production spaces. Then you've got some more closed door spaces, private studio spaces for visiting artists, residencies, or even local renters. There could be a money-making aspect to this by opening to the community. And if you have empty space, maybe that could be a good connection with creatives in the area. Apprentice studios for working on personal projects, student studios for their classwork, and of course, a good deal of student work is happening in these shared spaces. What about where to live? I'm talking about some of these different kinds of positions, apprentices, resident artists, and what does that really mean? What does it look like? An annual schedule of visiting artist residencies would constantly refresh students, apprentices, studio staff, and campus. A visiting artist, as I envision it, is someone who has something to offer in the field of Christian art, and also someone who would benefit from taking a break, who would benefit from maybe quieting life down a little bit, slowing down, living somewhere else, and taking some time to examine for themselves the intersection between their faith and their art. So I think there's a service that this kind of program could provide to the artists in that way, even as the artists provide a service to the program, to the studio. An apprentice, to become an apprentice, I think would be a big decision for a young person. And when I say apprentice, I'm thinking of someone who is already through their bachelor's degree. Somebody who's in that transitional moment after graduating, but not quite ready to go it alone or go on their own, and they're looking at, am I waiting tables? What am I doing right now? It's a kind of, a big world out there. So, what about an option like this where you join the production facility and you're going to work? You're going to work hard. And you're going to learn above and beyond the kind of bachelor's degree programming because it's your life. It's the step between student and professional. And, how do you attract these people? Well, take away their rent. Build a tiny house, and then don't charge them rent. You have to pay them less. They have a smaller salary because they don't have to pay rent, and they get to live in this cool tiny house. People like that nowadays. Okay, so it doesn't have to be expensive to be done well. I just had this idea. I'm having talks with a senior writer from the Chronicle of Higher Education, Scott Carlson, and he came up with this idea of what if you had tiny houses? How cool would that be to have a little kind of collection of visiting artists and apprentices? And you could have architecture students designing it. So, there's a lot of benefit all around creatively. And I think community is a big part of this. This is an important outcome to building the culture. Sometimes I wonder, what's our legacy? That's a loaded word. What does confessional Lutheran artwork look like? We have a couple examples, but if we're like a movement, like Impressionism, What is that? What's an identifying factor? Well, those kind of things develop out of a melting pot of community, out of an exchange of ideas. And so, some shared experiences built into the programming, built into the architecture, intentionally bringing people together, I think, can help to form that future movement. And that's, to me, that's the big plan. Like, let's make a movement. Money, ideally, endowments everywhere. But interestingly, the artist in residence, this is a business, earning from commissions. It starts as, I think that's the core of it, that it's market driven. The success of the studio is market driven. Sometimes when I was younger, I was really a purist about, I don't want to take grants. I don't want to get grants because it felt like cheating. I thought, well, Michelangelo didn't have grants. He had demand. He created demand. And so, I've wanted to do that. I've kind of thought that way about, if you're going to be real about this, people have to really want it. What comes next? Precedence. Okay, so this isn't necessarily a new idea, this idea of apprenticeship and mentoring. Bezalel and Oholiab, the favorites of artists in the Bible that most people have never heard of, they were, the great craftsmen of the temple or the tabernacle. Specialist. Tabernacle or temple. Scriptural, this guy is like a hero to me. Ancient Greek traveling sculptors, they would go from town to town and, kind of leave creativity in their wake. Jesus' disciples lived the life. Medieval Renaissance studios and a revival of the idea of the medieval Renaissance studios in the arts and crafts movement, closely related to the pre-Raphaelite movement. This, especially William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, was a reaction against the Industrial Revolution and the dehumanizing effects of factory work. Well, we're facing that same kind of thing today, right? The dehumanization of work has not gone away. We look ahead to, truck drivers are looking ahead to automatic trucks, and there's all sorts of fear about what is work going to look like. And that was back then too. And I would like to steer us in the opposite direction. I'd like to steer us back towards our bodies, back towards our hands, using your hands to make one-of-a-kind work in a world that's automating everything. Then why do humans matter anymore? Only when they do things that machines can't. There are some more recent precedents. I mentioned Cranbrook Academy in that program, artist in residence programs. I was involved with Paul Granlund at Gustavus briefly as an artist in residence, and more recently Richard Bresnahan at St. John's University as artist in residence. And that's a fascinating model to me, obviously. The idea of a research university, what happens in that situation? Well, there's teaching, but then there's also like this work that's happening, this real research, this real work. And from a student perspective, the idea of an internship is that you're going to insert yourself into a business in order to learn about that. Since we're at Bethany, I think we've already got some of these things happening here. This kind of model is already happening on campus. What are we doing? Who benefits? All kinds of people benefit in different ways. Visiting artists have kind of a once-in-a-lifetime experience, a little blip in their career that's something important. Students get a diverse experience. They've got different kinds of who knows who in front of them. Apprentices, obviously, are going to work the tails off and be a part of something that can transition them. By the way, the idea of an apprentice is an open time span, in my mind. If you're taken on as an apprentice, You stay as long as you think you need to. You stay until you feel like you're ready. So if that's 6 years, so be it. You're going to live in that tiny house, and you're going to, work for somebody else towards somebody else's ends. But if you feel like you still have something to learn in this situation, feel free to stay. You're part of the family. And if it's time for you to leave, God's blessings. Come on back. Congregations, I haven't talked much about this, but a really important part of this, in my mind, is populating confessional Lutheranism with artwork. I want to create demand and then create the supply. Art teachers, I was a high school art teacher for many years, and a lot of area Lutheran high school art teachers wonder what they should be doing, and grade school art teachers wonder what they should be doing. This could be a hub. This could be just like with community classes, it could have programming that that brings in different kinds of groups. Of course, we can put things out on the internet. KTV happens to be very close by. And who benefits? Well, we do this to the glory of God. Soli Deo Gloria. Not that he needs our work. And that is that. I'm out.
I don't have a PowerPoint, sorry. And in retrospect, I should have given you something way more interesting to look at than. So I'm Benji Inniger. I'm one of the theater professors here at Bethany. And so thanks especially to Hannah for putting this all together, to Cider for sponsoring it, Bethany, and my friends and colleagues who have presented before this. And I really think the biggest advantage I have in going last here is now I can just kind of take like 6 minutes of the things that they said and repeat it and just be like, oh, I didn't know they were going to talk about that. So that's my entire strategy for this whole thing. It's very interesting being up here as part of this, especially in reference to the 5 speakers that we've heard already. Just because I think, I don't know, it's a big benefit to see how we are thinking similarly about lots of things and how we're thinking differently about lots of things and how we approach this idea of what it means to be a Christian artist. And it's a pretty fascinating thing. So I graduated here from Bethany in 2006. Really the liberal arts thing, that the liberal arts Kool-Aid, if you will, that Bethany pours was a very good fit for me at the time, even though I didn't notice it at the time. But now I think maybe like a drink or like it was a little bit too effective for me because I kind of see myself as a professional dabbler, if you will. I like to dabble in all these kind of little things, and of course on the pros and cons list of all that, the advantage is that there's a lot of variety when you have a lot of interests and you have a lot of things that get you excited and that you want to explore. But now, of course, the cons side of that is 80% of the time, no matter what I'm doing, I have no idea what I'm doing. I feel like I'll probably never be really great at a thing, if that makes sense. I don't think I will ever be able to or necessarily have the desire to be the master of the thing that I'm doing. And conversely, like, I'm not sure if I'm ever going to have a life's work. There's that trope there that like, this is my life's work. This is what I've worked for. I shouldn't even call it a trope. Let me completely delete that. It's not a trope in the slightest, because I have the greatest admiration for people who pursue their life's work in a more defined, singular thing. And I think that's incredibly impressive, because there's a lot of pressure of that, because at the end of your life, or at the end of your working life, however that is, you need to look at your life's work and you need to determine if it was worth it or not. And I've had some really fascinating conversations with people who feel like they've landed on both sides of that thing. Like, yes, this is my life's work, it was 100% worth it, or I didn't get there. Especially in the arts, that's so highly competitive and so highly volatile. You know, if your life's work is to master the violin, is to master the English language, is to master woodworking, whatever it is, it's kind of tough sledding to try to be the best at that, or to compare yourself to the great masters of the past. And so it's just not something that I feel is in me. And part of it is just like, just bewildered, like dabbling in everything all the time. So that's my excuse for actually not being good at anything. Anyway, we'll see if it actually works. Yeah, and the other part of that is interests and inspirations and opportunities kind of ebb and flow throughout your life, right? Especially if you're interested in a lot of different things that you might be feeling this. You're like, riding a wave of this interest where this other interest kind of takes a back seat for a little while, right? That's kind of, I think, a blessing and a curse of the liberal arts mentality too, because again, the variety, the more often ability to like fuel your passions, whatever that passion happens to be, whatever wave of inspiration is kind of hitting you at the moment. And that's great, and that's really exciting. Now, again, the hard part of it is fighting the flow, right? If you're not feeling a certain thing and it's your job or it's your like whatever to do a certain thing, especially in the arts, I think it's really hard to fight against that flow. You're just not feeling it. But I think that is the difference between, that's what it means to be a professional in something too, is that to have the ability to have the, I guess, self-control, self-awareness, or however you want to say it, to be able to get up in the morning and do your craft, do your art, whether you feel like it or not, whether you're inspired to do it or not, because that's your job. That's the difference of being a professional and being amateur in the best sense of the word. Amateur being like doing something for the love of something, not amateur like amateurish, if that makes sense. I know for me, that's a big, like when I make music, when I write music, in the last couple of years, I've been doing it more and more for freelance things, and that was a big training point for me, I guess you could say, is having the ability to train to, no matter what's going on, to get up in the morning, go do whatever and make music and make it as good as I can. And that's hard. And that's just me, but you can apply that to sort of anything that, whatever you're doing, is that you need to, if you're going to pursue this professionally or whatever, then that's what you have to be able to do. Another kind of interesting thing is it's important for an artist to be cognizant of their voice. And this is something that I hear all the time. You've probably heard it a lot too. Is that like, oh, you're an artist, you need to know what your voice is. You need to know what your identity is as an artist. And I still don't know what that means, to be totally honest. It was several years ago, I applied for this grant thing, and I was denied the grant, and the primary feedback that I got because of it was, you are not able to properly or clearly define what your voice is. And I was like, yeah, that's true. I can't argue with that. And to this day, I still can't. Some people can. Some people have like a really concise, beautiful elevator pitch of what their voice is as an artist. And I envy that greatly. But having this sort of, I guess, liberal arts mentality or whatever, this dabbling, whatever you want to call it, it's a lot harder to define your voice. And maybe some of the things I'm going to talk about in a second here will influence what that voice is, or if it even exists or not. But it's a conundrum, right? If you need to survive as an artist, if you need to somehow present your skills, your craft, whatever, to the world and be like, oh, hire me over this person because I do this, you need to be able to define that. You need to be able to say how you're different or how how you can influence whatever the end goal is. And I think it's one of the most excruciatingly difficult things to do, is to be able to define this sense of not only vocation, why I'm doing this, but like what makes me different, or what makes whatever my project different, or whatever. It's almost impossible, I think. It's tough. If you heard Andy Overn speak yesterday, he said that what an artist does most of the time is say like, oh, look at me, world, listen to this is how it should be, I think is what he said yesterday. Like, take this topic, this is what I think it should be. That level of having something to say, or being that confident about the thing that you have to say, right? I don't disagree with him in the slightest, but I guess for my work, I see it a little bit differently. Like, I never think that anything that I have to say is informed enough, or clear enough, or frankly interesting enough to compare to what others have had to say already. That's just how I feel about it. And so I guess I see that thing a little bit differently, and maybe because my work is, I struggle to make stuff from nothing, right? To have just nothing but a picture in your head or whatever you're kind of doing and just create it. I don't think that's my strength. What I like to do more so, and what gets me a little bit more excited about whatever I'm doing, is to find ways to support work that already exists, or to enlighten it, or to try to reshape it in different ways. So I'm going to put it this way, which might sound a little bit pejorative, but I don't know if it will or not. I don't know. I feel like I'm in the business of predatory empathy. That's what I'm going to say. So if you ever watch, that's what we're doing here, predatory empathy, or you could replace empathy with just emotion if you wanted to. Now, in retrospect, I should have had a picture of this, which would have been a lot more effective. But if you ever watch Discovery Channel documentaries and stuff, which I personally love and hate at the same time, you have like the whale, right, or whatever, like a giant sea creature, underneath the surface, and on top is this big swirl of little silver-side fish or whatever. And so whatever that sea creature is coming in with jaws wide open, just to grab as many fish and as much nourishment as possibly can before you dive down and you never see him again. That's kind of what I'm talking about here, where the giant whale or whatever it is the empathy, and the little fish on top unawares are the audience, right? That's what we're doing. And really it is, because it's the job of and I'll call myself a designer for now. So whether that's designing music or designing whatever it is, any sort of designer, that's what you're doing, is that you're preying upon the empathy, or the potential empathy in your audience or your viewer or whatever. And watch any Netflix documentary, I don't care what it is, everything has an agenda, right? And how ethically, and frankly, like, I think art should have an agenda. Agenda tends to be a dirty word, but it should have a direction, it should have something to say. In that case, now how you ethically treat that agenda is a whole nother issue, of course. But watch any documentary on Netflix and tell me that there's not some predatory empathy going on here. And so that's what we're in the business of. And so now this is one of the things I think that makes a Christian theater artist a little bit different, is how we ethically treat that responsibility of predating upon other people's potentials of empathy. Does that make sense? Does that kind of sort of make sense what I'm saying here? So much of my work is kind of, like I said, in support, and I think that's really exciting. I think the best way to look at it is, if you can, in your mind, picture the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. And the actual cathedral is the that's kind of like the main event architecturally, right? And I kind of feel like what I do, or my work, is one of the most fun words to ever say in architecture. Otherwise, I'm the buttress, which is way fun. So if you're unfamiliar, what a buttress is kind of like those archy column things that are on the outside of the giant cathedral that kind of go around it and help support it and all those things. And so the job of the buttress is to surround and encapsulate and to reinforce the primary architecture. So in this case, or I guess in my case, the primary architecture would be the script, or would be the film, or would be the video game, or whatever. That's the architecture. And so it's my job to, as best I can, to encapsulate and to surround and to reinforce that primary architecture. And what's great about Notre Dame is that, those buttresses could be just as utilitarian as you wanted them to be. It could just be like a steel pillar coming out of the ground, put up screwed into the side of the architecture, and that's all it would need, right? But those buttresses are entirely unique and beautiful in your own way, and absolutely adds, if not is, the signature of Notre Dame Cathedral. So it's this really gorgeous piece of utility. It's this gorgeous piece of thing that it needs to survive, but it has a lot of great design and a lot of beauty to itself too. And so that's kind of what I see of the things that I do, because I'm no good at creating that stuff from scratch, but I really want to try to work hard to add the gifts that God has given me to sort of reinforce and hopefully help beautify whatever that primary architecture is. So let's talk about theater for a second. That's a lot of what I do here at Bethany, is I do a lot of theater. And theater is a very interesting place for a Christian artist. And I don't for a second want to suggest that being a Christian theater artist is any harder or less hard or whatever than frankly anything else. Like, can you imagine being a Christian lawyer, doctor, like those, and some of the ethical dilemmas that would come with that stuff too? That would be so hard. And so in no way am I making the case that it's so hard being an artist and a Christian at the same time. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that theater is unique and the arts is unique for a Christian artist. So I wonder if one of the things that we're looking for as Christian artists is not necessarily, one of our goals is not conversion or even evangelism in the cause, but maybe it's representation. And maybe evangelism is the effect or somewhere. And sometimes that's on a sliding scale too. That's not a rule by any means. But I think there's a great possibility in any sort of art that if conversion or evangelism, however you want to put it, is the first thing that happens, I think that has the potential to be really off-putting to people, or to just kind of be put into that thing of, or the guard goes up right away already. It's like whoa, keep your stuff away from me. I'm just here, to see a play or whatever. So you kind of have to treat each project on that sliding scale of that cause and effect. There's a misconception, I think, that in order to, and some of my friends here have talked about this, that in order to do Christian art, or to be a Christian artist, you need to produce Christian art. And that's not necessarily the case. And even in the Bethany Theater Department, I think there's a widespread misconception that because we do plays at Bethany Lutheran College, we do Bible plays or we do Jesus plays. Verbatim, these things have been said to us. We have never really ever done a Jesus play or a Bible play, sort of. But that misconception is out there. But are we Christian theater artists? Are we producing Christian art? You betcha we are. And so I think it's the responsibility of the Christian artist to interact with the world in a direct and tangible way, and maybe even, I'd argue, in a competent way. And that's why what we're doing here, training Christian artists and putting more Christian artists out in the world, I think is really important, because it's that idea of representation. The more representation that we have in the real world, the less mystique there will be to it. or the less, immediately like the guard will go up as soon as you say like, oh, I'm a Christian or I produce Christian art or whatever. I think maybe a good analogy for this would be Christian contemporary music. So oftentimes if you hear a Christian contemporary song, and I'm totally overgeneralizing here, so bear with me for that, that how many times have you heard like, oh, that's pretty good for a Christian contemporary song? It's automatically compartmentalized in this thing that's lesser than everything else. And I think there's a danger in Christian art for that to be compartmentalized exactly like that. I think another kind of similar thing that's going on, that I have a really good friend who's a professional sound designer on the East Coast, and she's a hardcore activist for feminism in theater. And so how many times does she get told like, oh man, you're so successful, I love your work, especially for a woman. And that drives her crazy. And now that's a totally separate issue, and I don't want to get into that right now, but it has some shared DNA, right? Where there's a compartmentalization that happens before you actually get to the whole of what you're talking about. And so like at some point, it's sort of like, how good do you feel if you're the leper with the least amount of leprosy in the leper camp? Like, do you really feel good about that? And that's not what we're gunning for here. We're not here to feel great about having the least amount of leprosy in the leper camp. We're here to like produce good art and put it out into the world. That was a weird analogy. I'm not sure why I said it, but I stand by it. So every art is engaged in the great battle of relevance all the time. All the time. And there's a lot of noise in this atmosphere, right? A lot of things that want to be relevant, a lot of people that want to be relevant. And I think that's one of the things that you really need to consider when thinking about getting into this field, is that, here, let me skip ahead a little bit here, is that you really need to consider why you're doing this, why you want to make art, who you're making art for, that kind of thing. Because, and this is going to sound like a total downer, and I don't mean it that way, but I think there's some reality to it, is that if you decide to be an artist, you will painstakingly you'll put your blood, sweat, and tears and go through a lot of negative stuff in order to create that great thing that you're trying to create, right? There's a book and then later a film about Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel called The Agony and the Ecstasy. And I can't think of a better collection of words that better describes making art, is the agony and the ecstasy. And there's a whole lot of agony, trust me, that goes into this. And so if you go through all that agony, you go through all that stuff to make this thing that's really precious to you, that you feel great about, that you want to put into the world, you need to know that that number one, you're probably never going to be the best. There's always going to be somebody better than you. And that there's always going to be somebody that's not going to like the thing you did, always. And the harsh reality is that probably the vast majority amount of people who experience that work that you did, those fortunate few, will probably totally forget about it within an hour or the next day. I think about this all the time, going on Bill's last Italy trip a couple years ago, and then just this past March, I took a group of students to London, and we went to the National Museum, right? And it's this gigantic building filled with the absolute best art of the best artists that in the history of human existence, right? And so what do? I run around and I try to find the couple of works that I personally love, my favorites, and bypass thousands of others in pursuit of just getting that thing that I know that I'm going to love. And so every single one of those works went through that painstaking process. Somebody went through, poured their blood, sweat, and tears and everything else into making that work that I just walked right on by because I was in a hurry to get to the bathroom or get to the next Turner painting. And so if you think about that, is one museum in the world. And that was, thinking back on Italy too, like going through and seeing these great masterworks. How many times did I do that? Just walk by all this stuff that's the greatest art in the world with no interest because I want to see this or because of blank. And that's art. That's what it is. And that's what it is for theater, for visual art, everything. And so you really need to understand why you're doing it, and maybe why you're doing it is because God puts you in a place at a certain time with a certain skill set and a certain mindset to really want to do that stuff. And maybe that's good enough. And maybe that's good enough for a voice as well. I don't know. But speaking more specifically of theater too, it's an interesting place because of some of the pitfalls and such that are associated with it. But we're engaged here in the Bethany Theater Department in the great battle of relevance, like I said too. And this is some of the ways that we're sort of doing that. We're trying to obtain representation in the world of theater. And just a couple examples. One is 10, 11, 12 years ago, something like that. Peter Bladel, if you don't know him, wrote a musical called Jam Jar Sonnets. And it was one of those things that now it's a published musical that people do. Not a lot of people. We always want more people to do it. But some of those people that have performed Jam Jar Sonnets are not Christian organizations. That's cool. That's representation, hopefully. The last play that we did was a little ditty called The Spiritual Tragedy of Dr. Faustus. And that was a fascinating experience too, because it's not something that I would say, it's a play that deals with a lot of theology, but it's by no means like a Bible play, anything. It just speaks of theology and struggles with faith and stuff. And so, because of that, and because of the conversations that we've had as a team working on that kind of thing, I really feel like we were able to grow in our faith working on it, and then also putting that together, and especially a play that doesn't end necessarily well for the main character, who kind of puts a negative spin on it at the end, leaves maybe the audience with a few more questions that they had when they first entered today, or entered the play at the time. So it's not a Christian play. The playwright itself, Christopher Marlowe, nobody knows for sure, but was rumored to be an atheist at the time that he wrote it. He certainly was trained well and knew a lot about theology and matters of faith and stuff, but nobody but God knows if he was when he wrote that play or when he died, etc. So not a Christian play, dealing with Christian issues. And after the very first performance, I had multiple cast members come up to me after and with very clear that our audience was challenged by it, but several people said, that was really interesting. I never thought of it that way. I'm going to go home and read my Bible. That's cool. That's representation. That's kind of what we want, right? We have, through the very, very generous help of the Bethany Studios and everything, anything that we either own the rights to or are public domain, we put out on YouTube. They make these really beautiful recordings of our plays, and then we edit it together and stuff. And right now, our production of Hamlet on YouTube has about 600,000 views. Peter Pan, 130,000. Christmas Carol, 150,000. Now, in the grand scheme of YouTube, I mean, Baby Shark has about 4 billion hits. So, like, in the grand scheme of YouTube, that's not a lot, but we're Little Bethany Lutheran College. That's representation. That's kind of cool. So the bottom line is that Christian art doesn't necessarily necessarily have to have that overt Christian content to it in order to witness, in order to kind of do what we're here to do, I think. And I think that's already noticed in our community a little bit. I think you could sub in that with family-friendly. People know Bethany Theater as a family-friendly thing. That's cool. That's the first step. That's representation. A couple times now, we've had the great privilege of bringing our shows to this thing called the Kennedy Center American College Theater Festival, which is this big conference of college theaters in a 7-state region. And we've been able to like pick up our whole show, put it in a truck, and go perform it somewhere else. And both of the times that we've done this, and Emily was there for both times too, she can attest to this, and it's a cool thing that our responders who are watching us do things like set up and screw boards together and things like that have said, something's a little different with you guys. And so it's like, you guys, and they couch it like, oh, you guys get along so well, and it's great teamwork and all that stuff. But maybe there's something else that's a little bit different. And if I were Emily Kimball, I would say very loudly and gleefully, because Jesus is in our hearts, which she said many times. But that's one of those things. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on spot. But that's one of those things that, like, we weren't asking for that. We're just doing what we do as Christian theater artists, and it was known that maybe something's a little bit different. That's interesting. That's representation. So my work as working in professional theater is kind of interesting too. And so, like, of course, there are times when you're challenged with the idea that you need to do something contrary, or you're asked to do something contrary to your ethics or contrary to your faith, or however you want to view that. And anybody, there's been a lot of people who have been put through that. I've certainly been put through that. And I'm not saying by any means that I've got a perfect track record in how I handle these things. By no means. But what I learned early on, for example, my first show that I was assigned in grad school, before grad school even started, we were in meetings before I took my first class, was a delightful little joyful play called Hurly Burly by David Rabe. And what that play is it's about these middle, lower level Hollywood executives who are just totally empty inside, that just have these completely unfulfilling, just empty. And they try to fill that emptiness with things like doing a ton of cocaine and trying to sleep with 16-year-old girls and things like that. And that's their answer of how they're going. And this was welcome to grad school, design this play. And so what I learned from I guess the decision I made really quickly, or what I tried to do, is I'm in this situation, can I do my job within my ethical limitations and still serve the play? And I think that's been my goal ever since. And of course, that's a thing that changes and moves throughout. Can I do everything that I need to do and still do really good work, but keep it within the bounds of my own ethical thought? There's only been one time that I can recall that I absolutely couldn't get around it. That I was working on this play that required I was sound designing this play that required a character who got basically busted for watching pornography. And we obviously didn't see the pornography, but they wanted the audience to hear the pornography, so it's my job to generate that. And I tried all kinds of things. I tried to lawyer my way through it. I tried to make little arguments here and there, but it's no, we need to hear this. And so at the end of the day, I still kind of cheated. I still sort of lied a little bit. So no matter what, I sinned somehow in this instance. But I kind of lied and I kind of cheated and gave them content that they were happy with, but was as close to my ethical, stuff that I thought. It's a struggle all the time. But that's just how I handle it. And I honestly could be more courageous. I can preach to the choir all day, no problem. But speaking boldly about my faith and stuff, not to the choir, is something that's hard for me. And so I need to be better at that. But know that if you're venturing out into a life of artistry out in the world, this is something that you're going to have to deal with, and you're going to have to figure out how you're going to deal with that yourself. And so just, yeah. And so ultimately, I have one more quick story to tell and then I'll stop. When I did one show out at Trinity Rep in Rhode Island, I designed The Merchant of Venice, and at the end of it, we did this little talkback thing, Q&A thing, and my boss, her name was Laura, introduced the designers afterwards, and the other designers first of all, the set designer was Eugene Lee, if you're not familiar, he designed every single set for Saturday Night Live that's ever existed. He's also designed Wicked and Sweeney Todd and stuff. That's the guy I was working with. And the other two designers were like big Broadway people, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. So when we got to the introductions, Laura was like, oh yeah, and the set design, Eugene Lee, like he's got, he had to reinforce his house because he's got so many like Tony Awards. He couldn't he was gonna collapse into his foundation. And Keith was our lighting designer. He did all these things. And Olivia, our costume designer, this things. Oh, and our sound designer was Benji. He's one of the nicest guys I've ever worked with. And for the longest time, that bothered me so much, partially because I was just totally envious of everyone else's credits, and just kind of putting into that compartment of like nice Christian guys. But the more I thought about it, I was like, okay, you know what? I don't have Eugene Lee's credits. I never will. I don't have this, and if that's the kind of thing that people are noticing about me, I know I'm doing good work, but she's not going to introduce that. She wouldn't have hired me if I didn't do good work, right? And so it's one of those things like, okay, I'm becoming increasingly okay with this the older I get, because that's how I'm trying to represent my work. It's still doing good work, still trying to stay within my my ethical center, but then also maybe something's different. You know what I mean? Kind of like what we were talking about for KCACTF. So, yeah. So I guess that's mostly what I had to say there. That it's a challenge, it's a great blessing, and all this stuff. And just if you're thinking about being a Christian theater artist, or if you're engaged in it, or whatever, then just how be a representative, and think about how you can best add representation to the collective of world artists. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
So my presentation, part 2. Yes, there's a lot to be said about the difficulties of translating Scripture and how it's distinct from translating anything else. I don't know if one of the things I wanted to bring up in part of my presentation was where I got started with translation, which was actually with Old English, Anglo-Saxon, in graduate school. I took an elective in Old English. And the final project was I translated some Old English riddles, which they don't have the answers. There's just the riddles. There's no answers. So there's some riddles we have no idea what the answer is. How do you translate that? How do you translate something that the anonymous author had an answer for in mind, but we have no idea what that is? Especially in a riddle which uses language very specifically to reveal important information. Anyway, one of the riddles was, we do know the answer to. The answer is bookworm. And the riddle goes something like, a moth ate words. Maybe I can do it, the whole thing. A moth ate words. To me that seemed some strange event. When he, that thief in darkness, consumed a word of men. And that statement's strong foundation too. But yet he was no whit the wiser for the word he swallowed. What am I? He's a bookworm. He eats the words on the page, but he consumes the word, but he does not gain anything from it. He's not the wiser for consuming it. And that was sort of my analogy for translation itself. Not that you're a bookworm, but that you actually consume the language. You consume the word. And that's an image from the medieval theologians, too, about studying Scripture. They actually use the image, maybe a crass image, of a cow chewing its cud. That in order to get every possible nutrient out of it, you turn it over and over and over in your mind. Again and again, you meditate on it. That's the image of meditating. And you digest it. And that actually is in Scripture, too, that the prophets digested the word because God gave them a scroll. Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and the Apostle John, I think. God gives them a scroll and says, eat it. Eat the scroll. And in the Psalms, we have, your words are sweeter than honey. And so I really like that image of eating language and consuming it and just letting it become a part of you.
I guess for me, the one rhetorical questions are great because you don't actually have to know anything. But that I wanted to kind of pose was idea that do you need to have an audience in order to have art, or is theater without an audience, etc. And so, just one thing to think about that my probably favorite contemporary artist is this guy named Andy Goldsworthy. Yeah, right. And what he does is that he just goes out into nature and makes these breathtakingly beautiful sculptures out of sticks and rocks and stuff that he just finds. He doesn't keep a record of anything he does, and the only way to view the art is just to happen upon it in nature. So nobody really knows how many things are out there, and if some of the things that he's made will ever be discovered, but it's just the most stunningly beautiful stuff. So I highly recommend looking up Andy Goldsworthy and just kind of thinking about that question, is that relationship between the viewability of art versus making art, and why that's important and how it's important.
I love Andy Goldsworthy.
So good.
But I think I have to correct you a little bit. Please. Because how would you look him up if there were no record?
Well, okay, yeah, fair enough.
So
he doesn't know.
He photographs, but the point, sometimes the point is that it's ephemeral. Like he'll make things, giant snowballs that contain different kinds of soil. And then they'll gradually melt and become a pile of clay and a pile of earth and a pile of grass or something. Like, they're kind of a riddle too. Speaking of riddles, is a bookworm a real thing?
Not like a worm, not like a worm, but like moths and cockroaches and beetles.
Do they eat paper?
They eat paper to get to like the leather binding of the old books, or the glue is sometimes they'll go for, or fungus that grows inside the pages. They'll eat that.
Delicious.
And so the words written on the page are kind of the collateral damage of them trying to get food.
Sure, nothing personal.
No, yeah.
I just wondered how a medieval riddle would...
Oh, no, they were a huge problem because books were so expensive and so precious. I remember hearing about this marvelous, fantastic library that had 20 whole books. There were, I mean, it was years worth of salary for one book. I mean,
sure.
The
labor involved.
The labor, the craft, the production, and then some worm comes along and just damages it so completely. Like, oh yeah, it's terrible. Yeah. Anyway.
I don't know if I have a coherent answer to whether there's more to my presentation. We maybe should move on.
Sounds good. Any other questions?
Jacob, what are you translating now? Are you working on anything?
What am I translating now? Mostly the sermon texts that I'm preaching on. I was working on another play by Euripides, Iphigenia in Aulis, which is about Agamemnon's daughter Iphigenia in Aulis, the city, and actually it sort of bookends to the Trojan War. At the end of the Trojan War, they sacrifice Polyxene at the tomb of Achilles. At the beginning of the Trojan War, the Greeks, Agamemnon is struggling with whether to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia to give them favorable winds to go to Troy in the first place. So it's like this horrible Trojan War is bookended by, just needless sacrifice, just in order to kill people. So I was working on that, but then I hit a roadblock of, and I don't know how in depth I want to go into this, but there's two completely different text traditions that are incompatible with each other. And a translator has to reach that point and say, I'm going to go down this way, or I'm going to go down this way. And I reach that point and say, I'm not going to translate anything. I'm going to work on something else. And I haven't had the time necessarily to go back to dedicate to it, but my plan is to keep translating ancient Greek plays. I've done a bit of translating of Marcus Aurelius, his meditations, just more for personal use than anything else.
Jason, your idea, you and I have talked about it, and I think parts of it can seem amorphous to some people, or it's like it's this hard thing to imagine. So I know we were at St. John's Pottery Studio, and that's like kind of somewhat adjacent to what you're talking about. So could you maybe can you give us a real world, super concrete breakdown of like what a place, because otherwise, there's always that idea that it just feels like it's this grand thing that you want to do and it's a pie in the sky, but instead it's like, no, there's super tangible examples, and you could go tonight and go drive up there and see this whole thing working. So could you maybe explain what's happening there or in a different place?
Sure. The St. John's Pottery it's built around artist in residence Richard Bresnahan. He started that residency in 1979. The college invited him to be artist in residence and asked him, how would you like to do things? What can we do for you? He had spent the previous 4 years as an apprentice with a 13th generation pottery family in Japan. And so he brought back a rich knowledge, a rich trove of old family knowledge that was passed down from generation to generation, and a philosophy of sustainability, how to make your own glaze, how to dig your own local clay and accept that the clay that comes from the ground where you're at is the right clay. It just is, because that's where you are. And so you're not shipping the right thing, you're adapting to what you have. So since that time, he's built a program that has apprentices, has been serving apprentices since that time. They live upstairs from the pottery studio. They've built North America's largest wood fire kiln, and Ben and I helped fire that. They fire it every 2 years. With this past firing was 12,000 works inside the kiln, and it fires round the clock for 10 days straight. So there's crews like coming from around the country to live and fire this kiln, which is a 2,000 degree inferno. And people are voluntarily taking time off of work, opening up this inferno and throwing wood, risking themselves. And it's just a beautiful thing. Like, why would you do something like that unless it was compelling? The community is very compelling, and the philosophy is very compelling. I spent a 30-day residency there and got to know the apprentices particularly. We go to lunch, and they're there around the clock. And one of the apprentices at lunch said, this is a lot of work. A lot of his work was wood splitting, because that kiln is hungry. For 10 days straight at 2,000 degrees, it just vaporizes lumber. So they're splitting wood, they're just stacking and stacking and stacking wood. And it's all trees from on campus. But he said, nobody would do this. There's no reason to do this unless you love it. Unless you like making pots. There's no reason to just hurt yourself this way. So I'm really fascinated by how does a system compel people to do these kind of things, to take time out of their life, and what is it about it that has such a magnetic draw? I think part of it is that you're getting together with your hands again. You're relearning how to use your body. When we were on monkey bars and jungle gyms and swings, we were pretty good at playing physically, using our bodies. And, we sit in desks and we we atrophy. We kind of lose that connection that we had. So I think that's compelling. There's also a very surprising hospitality that happens. When I showed up for my residency, Richard Bresnahan said, "We've dug up 300 years worth of local clay. Use as much as you think you can." It was like a dare. I'm not afraid. Use all the materials you want. You just free reign. And there's tea that happens every day, 10 o'clock and 3 o'clock. Everybody stops work, And what I saw was that there were all kinds of people coming in from tours or from the other side of campus, people who had heard about it, who had seen a documentary or something, and they just wanted to see what it was all about. And so they were all welcome. There's always this very interesting conversation happening around tea, which I found to be a very civilized activity. And I think we're aching for that too, a civil discourse. So the actual structure, your question, the actual structure of that place is that there's artist in residence, there's a studio manager who answers the phone, gives tours, answers emails, writes grants, splits wood, and he kind of manages all the work. There were 2 apprentices at the time. There are currently 3 apprentices. They cycle out as people move on, and they determine how much they need. There are student workers, work-study positions. There are visiting artists. I was one of those. And then there's a very supportive community, supportive campus. People who are very leaning into the whole thing and interested in what's happening. And everybody's always welcome to come back. That's what that firing was about. There were, every night there was supper, and this studio is just full of people having very fascinating discussions. We met a man who was in Orson Welles' last movie. Wow. Just one example of, the fascinating people that are drawn to this program.
I was going to comment. There's something very similar that happens in the theater world, and it's summer stock theater. And the way that you're describing it is it's completely secular, but it's a campus, and there's artists in residence, so there's guest designers who come, they do a specific show, and then they leave. But there's a hub of usually students who are there performing. They're there in a costume shop, in an electrician booth, and all sorts of things. And it's it's summer camp, but it's a work. You're there to work. And the results are, 8 musicals from Memorial Day to Labor Day. But the model sounds kind of similar, actually. It's like in a completely different side of the art world. Mm-hmm. And that's for money and for, a community that comes alive only in the summer to see 8 musicals a season. But it can work.
Yeah,
in
right.
in a slightly different but also very similar way.
There's an exciting event there that has a real product. Mm-hmm. And you can't deny that there's some very real learning happening mm-hmm. in the production of something new.
Mm-hmm.
My question is for Jacob, and the way you described translating, I appreciated that. And as a work of, it's almost like a separate work of art, or it was a separate work of art. Mm-hmm. And then bringing up the seminary, shouldn't we be redesigning our language translator skills to reach a higher level if we want to do what you're suggesting a translator really does? I mean, my idea is a seminary, you do the languages, you get what you need to get, you go off, and you have so many things to learn in that time slot. Mm-hmm. The way you describe a translator as someone who's relying on emotion and empathy and knowledge of the world, and most STEM guys, are they that smart? You're on camera.
I think there I would make a distinction between the translating ancient Greek tragedy, or kind of more creative translation, with translating scripture. I think what's most important about the seminary education of languages is not everyone needs to be a hugely knowledgeable scholar about the languages. They train us how to learn them, how to interpret them, what these certain language structures mean, what they signify, what these verb types do. But also they teach the resources. So in the language classes, it's basically teaching pastors how, or future pastors, how to be how to I don't know how to express this necessarily. Teaching the resources that can be trusted to have the answers in them. Not that the pastors themselves as exegetes have everything, crammed in their head as language scholars, but that they know how to use that information and know where to find the information. And what resources are more reliable than others, what lexicons have kind of what slant or bent or, things like that. What commentaries, will have certain theological assumptions that, won't necessarily lead to an accurate reading of Scripture in the original languages. And so I think in that sense, it's having a working knowledge of the languages is what happens at seminary. However, having a knowledge of something just human empathy would help in translating Scripture as well. To know the kind of impact, the force of some of Jesus' words and actions, of just the tenderness and the care that he takes towards people, or just the sheer force of John the Baptist saying, "You brood of vipers" type thing, just to get that emotional impact, it does take. It just, one of the most strikingly humorous and human moments of Scripture is when Jesus heals the man, and the Pharisees bring in his parents to question them, and they're like, "I don't know, go ask him." And they bring him in, and he's like, "I don't know why you asking me about Jesus. He healed me. That's all I can tell you. What, do you want to become his disciples too? Is that why you're so interested in him?" And it's you can translate that very dryly if you're just looking at it from a purely linguistic perspective. But and this kind of might tie back into what I mean by not just language experience, but human experience connected to language and life experience, will really give it that. If it doesn't necessarily come out in the translation, at least the translator is aware of some of the underlying things going on in the text. If that makes any sense. Okay. Yeah.
And your artistic product as a pastor isn't translation, but sermon.
Correct.
It's
yes.
a rhetorical art, and taking the understanding of what you've learned from the translating and the study and putting it into, like you were doing with explaining the significance of grabbing the beard and such.
Mm-hmm.
It explained those things in a sermon. You wouldn't necessarily put it in translation, but it's the sermon is the rhetorical art product in a sense that you would have as a pastor, and not
right.
Bible translation per se.
Yeah, correct. Absolutely. And that was also an idea I was tinkering about presenting on today, was the art of sermon writing as a distinct art.
So this is a question for everybody, but kind of aimed at Benji a little bit. So what I have here is, do you think it's really possible for a Christian to break through to a secular world in places like Hollywood, just theaters, thinking in general? It's so many of the things that we know is wrong is celebrated, and with it being so easy to get blacklisted, or it's not what you do, but who you know. Do you think it's actually possible? Because it's hard to think of when you're what are some Christian artists? It's hard to think of any.
I absolutely do, and I think it's not such a black and white answer, though it might be more of a process. So one advantage I think that's around today is that there has never been more of a demand for, let's just call it media, than ever before. For how much YouTube content is being created, and how many streaming platforms are there now. There is just an insatiable demand for content, and so I think there's never been a better time to have that kind of stuff accessible to anybody. And so is it all going to be, you know, and again, you need to make that choice in terms of what you're going to get into and what you're not going to get into. But the good news is that if you're, you know, eliminating a certain sect of media or whatever you're getting into, then there's never been still leftover options than ever before, if that kind of makes sense. And I think eventually, you know, once you sort of, it's not really the right word, but like once you establish, you know, like once you've been kind of doing it for a while, then eventually you start getting jobs based on your body of work and less about who you are, if that makes sense. And so like the more of the power comes to the artist over time, I think just by virtue of doing good work and the reputation of doing good work, and less of, oh, that Christian artist, let's put that Christian artist in the Christian thing, if that kind of makes sense.
I think if you're looking for it, over the years you're going to start to accumulate a list. You know, you said they're hard to think about, hard to find. And I'm fascinated by the idea of the Christian in popular culture. Chris Pratt comes to mind. Boy from northern Minnesota. Really letting his light shine, unabashedly. Avett Brothers come to mind as musicians. And I think if you're looking, you're going to find people who are navigating this successfully and with integrity.
Got one more thing on that. I remember when I took my first job, I was fully expecting like full onslaught prosecution. That was my expectation. And it almost never happened. For the most part, you know, like when you get to know people better and you talk about, you know, just beliefs and whether it be religious or political or whatever, when it came up, the vast majority of the response I got to my background was, oh, cool, or complete indifference. And that was very often the case. And in the theater world, kind of the joke is that like 3/4 of everybody you talk to is going to say, oh, I was raised Catholic. It's like everybody was raised Catholic, it seems like. So I guess that's been my experience, is when that stuff comes up, is that it's largely been met with, you know, just like, oh, okay, this is my thing, and you know, that sort of deal. So personally, it hasn't been a hindrance.
All right. Well, that brings us to 3:30. So unless someone has a final question, go ahead.
Sorry. So kind of off of what you said, Benji, where it's like, there's an insatiable desire for media with YouTube and all the different streaming platforms where anyone can just like put themselves out there. And it seems like so many people now are being like, I want to be a YouTuber, or like, I want to do this, and less people are being like, I want to be a doctor and like a physician and like practical stuff like that. Do you think does the world really need more artists? That's for everybody.
The quick answer. I don't think it's up to the world to demand if you're going to be an artist or not. I think it's up to the skill set that you have to demand of the world what you want to it, or to bring to the world what you want to it. And like, you know, who gives a rip what the world wants? It's like, what you're gonna do, what you're gonna do.
Yeah, I think the world, agreeing with that, I think the world needs more artists because there's always more people in the world. I think just people need to think of themselves as artists no matter what. We are creative beings because we are created by the Creator, right? And so, like, you don't have to think like, I am an artist, I'm going to be an artist in order to create something, to create anything. I think we can be okay with just like, I am going to make something or have a hobby or I don't know, just produce something creative in your daily life. And maybe this ties back to it doesn't matter what the world thinks, but I used to struggle a lot with, like, especially in grad school and shortly after, about getting published. I went to grad school for creative writing and literature, and especially fiction, like just getting published, getting my work out there in front of an audience, and it's so rough, and you wallpaper your bathroom with rejection notices. No matter what the quality or lack of quality in your work, that's just the way it is. And I was just like feeling so frustrated as an artist because I was not getting my work out to an audience. And now it's like I kind of don't actually send work out anymore because I've come to terms with my audience is, without this sounding like megalomaniacal at all, my artist is God, or my audience is God. Like, as a Christian, my life is lived for God. Everything I produce is for the glory of God. And so God is my audience. He's an audience of one that's intensely personal, and he's an audience of eternities. I mean, why would I want any human audience if, that all comes secondary, And so I think I don't know, for me that's been a really positive mindset of just like, I'm just going to create something and take a risk because, and kind of go into territory I've never gone into before. Because it doesn't matter what anybody thinks. It's like I don't know. I'm exploring these creative areas that are just a part of us as creations.
You have a really interesting question, and I think I would want to take a surgeon's knife and divide entertainment from art, and really be, clear about what do these things mean. Some the YouTuber phenomenon, I think people are following the money. It seems like a way to make a lot of money and have fun. It's like the lottery, I want to be the next one that wins. And how do people accomplish that? A lot of times it's through sort of cheap gimmicks, like being a jester, being a fool, that kind of character. And I'm not trying to imply that entertainment should be disparaged, but I think when we're talking about art, there's a different intent. I think to be an artist is to try to communicate what it's like to be a human, what it's like to be alive. To be an entertainer is to try to maybe help people escape what it is to be human or to be alive, to get away from it sometimes. And both can be nobly done. But I don't think the YouTube phenomenon is necessarily the same as like, do we need more artists because we're saturated? They're not always artists. And I think people follow the money. So like the doctor thing, like if there are no more doctors, well, those salaries are going to be pretty appealing, to try to make it come back, like is happening with welders nowadays. And so the market kind of determines these things. That doesn't really help you as an individual, but we don't have to worry about whether the world needs more artists or more doctors. I think in a market economy that takes care of itself. It just swings the way that it's needed, I think. Got a question?
Could we maybe just say that to answer all our questions, if you just do it to the glory of God, it answers why, how, what, when, and if we should? Just a question.
Yeah, I think definitely that's the doctrine of vocation. That we do what we do because we've been blessed, because we have a sure assurance of heaven, and we respond with the gifts that we've been given. And then, you can move forward with confidence. Who cares? I mean, grand scheme of things, we're just a little blip, right? But a stranger here.
Should we give our speakers one last round of applause?